Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm back with another what to look out for before buying video. The car that I'm going to be reviewing in this video is very special to me, a 99 Lexus SC 300. I've been looking for a nice clean example of these for a long time, and when I saw one for sale in California, I did not hesitate, drove down, picked it up and drove it back the same day. As is the case with most of the rear-wheel drive offerings from Toyota or Lexus, most of the surviving SCs out there have either been drifted or modified beyond measure. This, coupled with the fact that the last production year for this car was over 24 years ago, makes it very hard to find a nice, clean, unmolested one for a reasonable price in today's market. In this video, I'll be going over all the common specs and features of the SC 300 chassis, a few common quirks and things to look out for before you buy this car, and finally, a test drive to make sure you're getting the right buy for the right price. So let's jump right into it. The first generation of the Lexus SC, which stands for Sports Coupe, ran from 1992 to 2000 in the US domestic market. It was offered in two variants, the SC300 and the SC400. The SC300, which we'll be focusing on in this video, came with a 3-liter inline-6 engine designated the 2JZGE. An automatic 4-speed transmission is much more common than the manual transmissions, as those were offered only from 92 to 97. The big brother of the SC300, which is the SC400, came with a 4-liter V8 engine designated the 1UZ-FE. There were no manual options for this car. For the model year 1998, Toyota added their variable valve timing technology, which is called VVTi, to both the SC300 and the 400. At the same time, both the engines switched from a distributor-based system to a coil-on-plug setup. The 2JZ and the 1UZ engines offered in this car are well known for their long-term reliability. Apart from the engine and the transmission, there are no major differences between the SC300 and the 400 chassis. So a lot of the things that I go over in this video will also apply for the SC400. For the model year 1997, Lexus came out with a major facelift to both the 400 and the 300 chassis. The design of the front bumper was changed quite a bit. It got new fog lamps and also a grille. At the back, a modified set of taillights were available, plus a new rear bumper design. And finally, rounding off the exterior changes, side skirts were added as well. In the interior, there were some changes to the center console area. The shifter was changed to a gated design, and wood trim was added to both the area surrounding the shifter trim piece and the ashtray. 99 and 2000 model years got perforated leather inserts on the seats and also on the steering wheel. The gauge cluster was also updated, going from an LED-based design to a cold cathode setup. This results in a much cleaner and brighter display. As the production numbers for these cars slowly dwindled towards the year 2000, the facelifted model years are a little harder to find compared to the pre-facelift ones. If you are unable to find a facelifted version of the SC, you could always go the route of aftermarket body kits to get the look you want. Now that we know a little more about the SC chassis, we can move on to the next segment, which are the common quirks with these cars you should know before buying. The last model year for the production of these cars was the year 2000. This is over 24 years ago now. Consequently, most of the Lexus OEM parts for these cars are completely discontinued. This, coupled with the fact that there weren't that many of these cars made in the first place, makes finding certain replacement parts, especially interior trim pieces or exterior body panels, very difficult. Let me show you an example. One of the most commonly known failure points for these cars are the interior door panels. The doors on these cars are extremely long and heavy. Therefore, every time the door is closed, all the force required is concentrated on this little armrest attached to the door panel. As you can see, I was very lucky to find an owner who kept his car in good shape and was very gentle with it. However, heavy-handed owners will often rip this armrest off completely. So let's imagine you find an SE with broken door panels and you want to replace them. A quick search on eBay reveals the exorbitant prices that you have to pay to replace one of these door panels. Keep in mind that many of these panels already have existing damage too. For example, this one is cracked over here. I'll show you more examples of these interior trim pieces that you need to be careful with, but the point that I'm trying to convey is, if you find an SE that you're interested in but has a bad interior, and you plan to replace the entire interior with a clean one off of eBay or in the junkyards, I would highly recommend waiting a little longer and finding an SE with a better interior, even if you have to pay a higher price. Let's look at some other examples of hard to replace trim pieces. Just above the door panel is this long and narrow plastic trim piece covered in vinyl that surrounds the window. As I mentioned earlier, the doors on these cars are extremely heavy, so whenever the door is slammed shut, this plastic trim piece takes a lot of the force. As a result, it is extremely common for this trim piece to become cracked, especially in this area where the driver or the passenger may rest their arms. To show you an example of the crack, this is the window trim piece from the driver's side of my car. As you can see, the plastic is completely cracked and the only thing holding the trim piece together is the vinyl. Eventually, The force of the crack separating the two pieces of the plastic will also tear the vinyl up. So if you manage to find an SE in which the window trim piece is cracked but the vinyl is still intact, it would be a good idea to reinforce the plastic trim piece from behind so that the vinyl does not separate any further. I'm currently working on modeling and 3D printing a stronger replacement for this trim piece using better and thicker plastic so that this long-standing problem can finally be solved for SE owners. So stay tuned if you'd like to know more about it. Another very interesting aspect of this car related to the doors are the door hinges. As you can see, the door hinges are immensely complex and gigantic. This is because the doors on this car are extremely long and heavy. After many years of opening and closing these heavy doors, the hinges will start to sag. In really bad cases, the door will sag so much that it starts hitting the fender and chipping off the paint from the door or the fender. Repairing these door hinges, from my knowledge, is a pretty complicated process. It also seems like you need access to a machine shop to be able to complete it. If you're interested in learning more about this repair, I've included a link to a blog post in the video description below where someone has successfully completed this repair. Another interior trim piece that's commonly cracked on these cars is the center AC vent. Because of the constant changes in the temperature of the air coming out of the vents, the plastic undergoes a lot of stress and eventually cracks. To my knowledge, there is no aftermarket replacement for these parts, and the OEM part has long since been discontinued. In addition to the window trim piece, this is another part that I'm looking at modeling and making a better part by 3D printing. Just under the AC vent is another component that is commonly flawed, the climate control unit screen. The screen on the unit is known to bleed, and eventually it is very hard to read the symbols such as whether the AC is in recirc or whether the temperature is hot or cold. While we're on the topic of screens and displays, the gauge cluster may also start having problems as the car gets older. The most common issue reported is the miles per hour gauge no longer working and the odometer screen going blank. They tend to happen at the same time. In the video description below, I'll include a link to where you can send your cluster or your climate control to get them fixed if you're having these issues. One of the most notorious and common issues with these cars, and something that seems to plague many Toyota and Lexus models, are the lower ball joints. As you can see here, the ball joint is integrated into this lower control arm, which also has two bushings. If the lower control arm hasn't been changed in a long time and is very worn, the ball joint can break. This is a very dangerous situation, especially at high speeds, because now the steering knuckle is basically separated from the chassis. On this control arm, as I mentioned earlier, there are two bushings and one ball joint. The two bushings can be replaced individually. However, the ball joint is integrated into the control arm, and the only way to replace the ball joint is by replacing the entire control arm assembly. With something as critical as a lower ball joint, the only replacement part I'd suggest is OEM and nothing else. Unfortunately, each control arm from Lexus cost well over $500. A very useful piece of information to keep in mind is that the SC300 and the 400 share a lot of suspension components with the Mark IV Supra, which was produced from 1993 to 1998. The Toyota lower control arms are much cheaper than the Lexus alternative, but still not cheap by any means. So keep this in mind before buying this car. While we're on the topic of suspension, here is another thing to look out for if the SC that you're interested in has been lowered in any form. There is a very important wiring harness that runs in this car behind the fender and just above the wheel well in this area. If the car is lowered, there is a small chance that the tire may rub on this plastic trim piece and subsequently damage the wiring harness just above it. The proper way to lower your SC is to wire tuck this harness away from the fender area and up into the engine bay like this. So if the car has electrical issues, is lowered and doesn't have a wire tuck, then be careful before buying it. This really covers the more expensive or major issues that you can avoid before you buy your SC. One of the more common and easier to fix issues is the steering wheel tilt motor no longer working. This is because of a plastic gear inside the motor that is stripped, and it causes a screeching sound like this. This is a fairly easy and cheap fix, as the replacement plastic gear is still readily available. In the next video on my channel, I'll be showing you how to fix this issue on your SC, so stay tuned if you're having this issue. The final common issue that I can think of in this car are floppy side mirrors. This is another issue that I've encountered and fixed on my SC already. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this repair, as I will be documenting it in a separate video. But this is another fairly easy and expensive DIY fix, so you don't have to worry about discontinued parts. If the SC that you're interested in looks good so far, let's move on to the next segment, which is opening up the engine bay and inspecting the fluids and components inside. Here's a quick rundown of the components we'll be inspecting under the hood. First up is the radiator up front. Just behind it is a power steering fluid reservoir and pump, followed by the engine oil and transmission fluid dipstick right next to each other, and finally the brake fluid reservoir and its brake booster. We'll start off with the radiator. The first thing you want to inspect is the condition and color of the plastic on top. The previous owner replaced this radiator, which is why the plastic is still black. On old radiators which haven't been changed in a long time, the plastic becomes brown or olive because of the heat of the engine bay and the coolant. When it gets to this stage, the radiator should be replaced because it can split and dump coolant all over the engine bay and possibly lead to overheating of the engine. While you're inspecting the radiator, another very important thing to note is the kind of coolant that's being used in it. A quick warning before you open up any part of the cooling system. Never open the radiator cap whenever the engine is hot or the car has been recently driven. Always allow at least an hour for the car to cool down before you open up the cap. This will avoid any risk of burns or splashing coolant. The only type of coolant in there should be the one that is recommended by Toyota, super long life coolant, which is pink in color. The fluid level should also be all the way up to the brim of the radiator cap like this. If the coolant looks thick, white and milky, you should probably walk away immediately. This may be because of a blown head gasket which causes mixing between the engine oil and the coolant. Unless you're looking for a Project SC or a shell, blown head gaskets are an expensive affair. You'll have to remove the head, check whether it is warped, and then replace the head gasket and all associated components. If you're not able to open up the radiator cap, you can always check the condition of the fluid in the coolant overflow reservoir over here. Finally, don't forget to check the condition of the radiator hoses. They should be soft and pliable and not firm and brittle, as this means that they are old and need to be replaced. Next up is the power steering fluid reservoir and pump. This is the site of a very common confusion for many Lexus and Toyota owners. Toyota recommends only using Dexron 2 or 3 automatic transmission fluid in the reservoir. This fluid is red in color, whereas regular power steering fluid is clear or amber. So if you inspect the fluid and see anything other than a red color on your paper towel, the previous owner has used the wrong type of power steering fluid and it needs to be flushed from the system. The wrong type of fluid in the power steering system can cause expensive damage to the rack and pinion and many seals around the system. Don't forget to check the level of the fluid in the reservoir too. As you can see, one side of the dipstick contains a level for when the fluid is cold and the other side for when the fluid is hot. Next up are the engine oil and the transmission fluid dipsticks. The engine oil dipstick is pretty straightforward. Simply pull it out, wipe it out on a paper towel, reinsert and pull out again. Make sure the level of the oil is between these two dots in the dipstick. Healthy engine oil should be a light amber in color. If it is excessively dark or brown and smells burnt, or has metallic looking flakes in it, you should probably walk away, as this points to internal engine damage. If the oil looks milky, this is another sign of a blown head gasket and another sign to walk away as well. The transmission fluid dipstick is an interesting case. To measure the level of the fluid, we have to get the engine up to operating temperature and then measure it while the car is running. So we will do that after a test drive. However, we can definitely inspect the condition of the fluid. The recommended transmission fluid for this car is Toyota Type 4. This is a light red or pink in color and should smell nice and sweet. Again, if it looks excessively dark or smells burnt, you should probably walk away, as this points to the transmission not having been maintained properly. The final thing to inspect is the brake fluid reservoir. Healthy brake fluid should be clear or light amber in color. If it looks excessively dark, it probably hasn't been changed in a long time, and you should probably get it flushed as soon as you buy the car if you decide to do so. There are also two marks on the side of the reservoir, max and min, so you can make sure the fluid is at the right level. On the top of the engine is the oil filler cap. Unscrew it and have a look under it. If you see a small amount of a milky residue over here, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a blown head gasket. There's always a small amount of moisture in engine oil due to condensation from the atmosphere. Normally what happens is, when the car is taken on a long drive and the engine reaches operating temperature, this moisture burns off. However, if the car hasn't been taken on a long drive, or rather has been taken on short trips frequently, the moisture does not get burnt off, but rather stays in the engine oil and then combines with it to make a milky looking residue. Small amounts of this residue on the underside of the oil cap are totally normal and nothing to worry about. However, if you see large amounts, and this coincides with other signs of a blown head gasket such as milky looking coolant in the radiator, you should walk away immediately. Another very common issue with these cars, especially ones with higher miles on them as is common, are oil leaks around the engine bay. One of the most common locations for oil leaks on these engines are the valve cover gaskets. They're pretty easy to identify by looking, as you can see that oil starts pooling in this area. This oil leak also causes a characteristic burning oil smell. The oil from the leak drips onto the exhaust manifold, which is hot, and burns it all off. Another very common location are the camshaft seals up front. They are located behind this timing cover, and you can see the oil residue that indicates that there is a leak. The valve cover gasket is pretty easy to replace, However, it does take some time as the intake manifold is located right above them and needs to be removed first. The cam seals are a little more involved as it basically requires a timing belt change. However, this is a very common issue on these cars and therefore there are a lot of tutorial videos online. To continue our inspection, we're going to start the car up and look at some things. On a cold start, the RPM should settle at around 1200 pretty quick. Move the shifter through the various gears of the transmission slowly. Each of the shifts should be very smooth and there should be no jerking or jumping of the RPMs on the tach. Now is also a good time to check out the motor mounts. Move the gear from park to reverse and check for any vibrations in the cabin. Then shift into neutral. If you felt any vibrations in reverse that go away when you put the car in neutral, that means the motor mounts are likely bad. If you have a buddy with you, it's a good idea to have him start the car up while you monitor the exhaust at the back of the car. If you have a small amount of grayish or white smoke on a cold start, especially in cold climates, this is totally normal as this is just water. However, smoke that is blue in color or thick and white is not a good sign. If you have blue smoke coming out the back, this may point to leaky valve stem seals in the engine. If you have thick white smoke coming out the back, even after the car has sufficiently warmed up, this is a classic sign of a blown head gasket. Both of these are pretty expensive issues to fix, and unless you're interested in a project or a shell, you should walk away. Here is a quick trick to test out the brake booster. With the engine off, depress the brake pedal a few times. Initially the pedal will be soft, but after a few pumps, it should become firm. If the pedal never becomes firm, however, this could point to a leak somewhere in the brake system or a bad master cylinder in the brake booster. To continue, keep the brake pedal depressed as much as you can after a few pumps, and then turn the engine on. As you can see, the pedal should now sink to the floor and become very easy to depress. With all this checked out, we can start driving the car. While driving, keep a close eye on the engine coolant temperature gauge on the left and make sure it never goes above halfway. For the first part of the test drive, we'll drive the car through the streets. Keep an eye on the tachometer on the left of the gauge cluster. As you slowly increase your speed, the RPM should slowly rise up and then shift smoothly into the next gear. One of the signs of the transmission starting to go out is when it starts to slip. Basically, a slipping transmission is when you hit the gas pedal and the RPMs correspondingly go up, but the engine seems to be lacking in power and the car does not respond in terms of movement. The most common reason that this would happen is if the fluid levels in the transmission are low. However, it could also be because of something more serious, for example, internal damage within the transmission. So if the transmission starts slipping on your test drive, you probably want to walk away. Also watch the tachometer as the car slows down to a stop. As the car slows down, the RPM should also drop smoothly and eventually settle at ideal RPM, which is around 800. For the next phase of the test drive, you want to find a nice deserted parking lot. Use the space to take the car on some nice tight turns while turning the steering wheel all the way from lock to lock. While you do so, listen for any creaking or cracking sounds from the suspension up front. If you hear them, this is most likely the lower ball joints that we discussed earlier going bad. As you can hear in the video, the lower ball joints in my SC are most likely worn and probably need to be replaced. During this, also try to monitor whether the steering wheel is nice and easy to turn without much resistance. If the steering wheel is a little hard to turn, or if you hear any whining sounds coming from the front, this may point to a bad power steering pump. For the final part of the test drive, we're going to take the car on the freeways. This will allow us to really stretch the car's legs and monitor how the engine and the transmission perform under increased loads. Just like before from when we drove on the streets, keep a close eye on the tachometer and make sure that the RPMs are nice and steady if you're cruising, and change properly as you speed up and down. After making sure that you have adequate space in front of you on the road, Floor the gas pedal by pushing it down all the way to the floor. The transmission should downshift almost instantaneously. Keep in mind that a slight jerk from the transmission as it downshifts is totally normal. We just want to make sure that there is no slippage or lack of power when you floor the gas pedal. At the end of the test drive, park the car but do not turn it off so we can check the level of the automatic transmission fluid. Just like the engine oil dipstick, remove the transmission dipstick, wipe off, reinsert, and then remove it again. The level of the fluid should be in between these two marks on the dipstick in the area labeled hot. So that brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you found it informative and you find it helpful in buying your dream SC. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.